Just a few announcements firstly. Once again, thanks to those who have brought flowers for Our Lady. I would like to remind you to bring your rosaries and crucifixes for the blessing tomorrow morning. The schedule tomorrow is an 8 o'clock Mass with sermon, which will be followed by devotions in honor of Our Mother of Perpetual Help, and finally a short benediction with the closing of the mission. There will be general confessions available after Mass this evening, and I think there will be time tomorrow morning after the benediction also before I have to leave. As I told you, in some places Redemptorists tell little jokes before the sermon to lighten up the atmosphere, so I better tell you one for tonight. Little Johnny comes home and comes up to Mommy and says, "Mommy, did you hear what Father said the other night in his sermon on death, that dust we are and into dust will one day return? Is that what he said?" And Mommy says, "Yes, Johnny, that's very good that you were listening." And Johnny says, "You better come upstairs to my bedroom and look under my bed, because there's something either a-comin' or a-goin'." For a blessing on the sermon. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, amen. I would like to speak on two subjects this evening and leave another one for tomorrow morning, which is very important. I will be speaking both on prayer and devotion to Our Lady tonight. I would like to start off firstly with prayer. St. Alphonsus de Liguori, who is called the Doctor of Prayer, says that whoever prays will certainly be saved, and whoever does not pray will certainly be damned. Now, having gone through these spiritual exercises of our mission together, we are strengthened in our faith and in the morality that we have to live as good Catholics. But while we are still strengthened in our good will, we realize that our enemies are strong, the world, the flesh, and the devil, and that they're constantly battling us. And we also realize that we're still relatively weak, even though we have received strength through the sacraments and through the sermons. Prayer, therefore, is absolutely necessary for us. And I would like to speak about prayer in three small points. Firstly, the necessity of prayer. Secondly, its efficacy. And thirdly, the conditions of prayer. Firstly, let us consider the necessity of prayer. And let us ask, first of all, what is prayer? Saint Teresa of Avila says that prayer is a lifting up of the mind and the heart to God. Saint Alphonsus also describes it as asking God for the things that lead us to salvation. What happens if we don't pray? If we neglect prayer, we will certainly be lost. Remember that we need air in our lungs in order to breathe. And what happens if, by some chance, we are put in a place where there's no air? We stop breathing, and we suffocate, and we die. Prayer is the breath of the soul. If we stop breathing spiritually, in other words, if we stop praying, we die spiritually. We'll fall into mortal sin. Prayer, therefore, is absolutely essential for us to save our souls. Without actual grace, we cannot avoid sin. We need God's help in our day-to-day lives to fight temptations. Due to concupiscence, in other words, the desires for lowly earthly things, St. Thomas Aquinas tells us, continual prayer is necessary after baptism in order to enter heaven. And in a lovely passage from the Old Testament, the wise man tells us, "As I knew that I could not otherwise be continent," in other words, pure, "except God gave it, I went to the Lord and I asked him for it." See, without actual grace, we cannot merit heaven, nor can we even do anything supernaturally good. Remember those words that our Lord says in the Gospel, "Without me, you can do nothing." Jesus doesn't say, well, without me you can do, well, certain things. No, he says specifically, without me you can do nothing. Therefore, if we can't do anything without him, surely we ought to ask him for his graces then, for his help, for those lights necessary in order to work out our salvation. Actual grace comes to us from God only through prayer. St. Augustine sums it up like this: "No one is saved except by the call of God, and no one who is called works out his own salvation except with the help of God, and no one merits this help except by prayer." We see then how necessary prayer is for our salvation. Let's go on to the second point now to consider its efficacy. If we pray, we will certainly be saved. Remember those wonderful words of Jesus in the Gospel: "Ask and you shall receive. Seek and you shall find. Knock and it shall be opened unto you." Why is it that Jesus not only says that first clause, "ask and you shall receive," but why does he repeat it in different words? It's because the importance of prayer, its efficacy. He wants us to be sure that our prayers will be heard by him. You remember that parable that Jesus tells us in the Gospel also about the man in the night. A friend has come over to his house, and the man realizes, oops, I don't have any bread to give my friend. So he goes over to his next door neighbor, who's asleep already, knocks on the door, knock, knock, knock. No answer. Knocks again, knock, knock, knock. No answer again. Knock, 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 knock. So finally there's a voice from upstairs that shouts down, "Hey, go home, we're all asleep up here." So what does that man do? Does he give up? No. Knock, 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 knock. And what does Jesus tell us in the Gospel? He says that guy upstairs, even if he can't stand his next door neighbor, he's going to come down just to make sure that he stops knocking at the door. Likewise with God then, we have to continually ask him for his graces. Ask and you shall receive. Seek and you shall find. Knock and it shall be opened unto you. We can also say, concerning the efficacy of prayer, that God hears our prayers without delay. Now, this doesn't mean that he always answers our prayers without delay, and we'll see that in a little while. But he does hear our prayers without delay. And there's a good story about this in the Old Testament with the prophet Daniel. The prophet Daniel spent 3 weeks in prayer and fasting to God on behalf of the Jews in Babylon, in captivity. And the angel Gabriel, after 3 weeks of this, came down to Daniel and said, "Daniel, from the very first moment that you began praying to God, he already heard your prayer." God does hear without delay, even if he doesn't answer our prayer immediately. We should be assured also that all things are given to those who pray. Now, we can say, why is it that sometimes I may pray for this or that? Maybe I'm asking for a yellow Lamborghini, or maybe I'm asking for all sorts of, maybe I'm asking for a Porsche, red Porsche. And why isn't it God doesn't give me these things? Well, we have to be honest with ourselves. God gives those things that are helpful to our salvation. If he sees that we're asking for something that's going to lead us to hell, do you think that God's going to give it to us? No. Like a good father, he's going to do what's best for us. You ask, says the Apostle St. James, and you do not receive because you ask amiss. In other words, we're asking for things that are harmful. Otherwise, however, if we do ask for the things that help for our salvation, and there are the various things that we can always ask for, are, as St. Alphonsus says, an increase in the love of God, for final perseverance, for the growth in Christian virtues, etc. These things we can always ask for, and God will answer our prayers. So, you have not, the Apostle James again says, because you ask not. Why is it then that so oftentimes we're too proud? Why is it that oftentimes we struggle with temptations? Why is it that we don't have a real burning charity for our neighbor and speak ill of them instead? It's because we haven't asked for this grace. It's because we haven't asked for true humility, for true forgiveness, for true charity towards our neighbor. We need to ask for these things. God is so open-handed with us. He wants to give these graces to us. If only we open our own hearts and ask him to fill our hearts with those graces. Now, speaking about the things that we can pray for, we may mention also that we may and should pray for sinners. We see this in the Old Testament. Abraham even beseeched the Lord for the city of Sodom. We remember also how Moses constantly interceded with God on behalf of the Israelites. Even if someone dies in a bad state, we should not simply stop praying for that person, because we don't know what God may have done in the last moment of their life. And to give you some encouragement, I would like to tell you two stories that come from the life of St. John Vianney. One story concerns the Carmelite friar, the Venerable Hermann Cohen. Hermann Cohen grew up in Germany as a Jew. He converted to Catholicism as a young adult. He became a Carmelite friar. His mother, a fervent Jewess, was absolutely irate with her son for having become a Catholic. And one day, his mother died. The Venerable Father Hermann Cohen was distraught, understandably, because she had made no signs of contrition, no sign of acceptance of the Catholic Church. And so he really questioned the salvation of her soul. Sometime afterwards, it was on the feast of the Immaculate Conception, he received a letter, which I believe was from the Curé of Ars, who had received a vision from God. The Curé of Ars and the Venerable Father Cohen didn't know each other at all, never met, never even heard of each other probably. And the Curé of Ars said, just to let you know, but your mother is saved. She's in purgatory and needs your prayers. You can imagine how the Venerable Father Cohen felt when he read that. But the good curé went on to explain what he had seen in this vision. Your mother, while she was dying and lying in a coma so that no one could see what was happening in the center of her soul, was given a strong grace by God, a light to understand that the Catholic Church is the true church of the Messiah, that Jesus Christ is the Savior promised in Genesis, and that outside the Catholic Church there is no salvation. And that his mother at that moment received that grace and accepted it, so that she received the grace of baptism by desire, even though no one else around saw what happened when God touched the center of her soul. You can imagine then the great exultation that the good Father Cohen felt when he read this coming from so great a saint as St. John Vianney. Certainly that should be an encouragement to us also. How often does this happen? We don't know, and we can't presume that it happens very frequently. But nevertheless, it should give us confidence to keep on praying, even for those who seem certainly to have been lost. Another story from the life of St. John Vianney, which I'd like to relate to you. One day, St. John Vianney was there in the confessional at Ars, and a lady had come into the confessional line. She was grieving very much because her husband had just recently committed suicide by throwing himself off a bridge into the water. He had not been a practicing Catholic. And as a result, the widow was in despair about his salvation. When all of a sudden the door to the confessional opened up, St. John Vianney stood up, got out, looked around the crowd, and came straight to this woman, whom of course he had never seen before, nor she him. And he whispered to her, "Your husband is saved. He's in purgatory. Pray for him." You can imagine how surprised she was. And then he went on to explain, "Your husband, between the time that he jumped off the bridge and before he actually drowned in the water, was given the grace to make a perfect act of contrition, and therefore he is in purgatory, but he is saved." And the woman said, "But how could he have been given such a grace?" And St. John Vianney continued, "Do you remember how you used to pick flowers from your garden and ask him to take them to the statue of the Blessed Virgin in your local church?" She nodded, "Yes, I do." And the saint said, "Because of that little act of homage to Our Lady, which he did for your sake, Our Lady gave him the grace of that perfect act of contrition." So, once again, we should never doubt the omnipotence, the power of God, and his desire to save. How often does this happen? Again, we can't say, but it certainly does mean that we should never become discouraged in praying for sinners. One might object, however, and say, well, what about the case where I'm a sinner, maybe I'm in the state of sin right now, and we know that God doesn't hear the prayers of sinners, so what's the use of my even praying when I'm in a state of sin? Okay, let's make some distinctions with St. Alphonsus. For the sinner who wants to remain in sin, who has absolutely no intention to get out of his sin, to give it up, no, God won't hear his prayers. But for the sinner who really does want to get out of that sin, to give up those sins, then indeed God hears the prayer of that sinner, not for the sinner's sake, because of course he can't merit anything, but on account of the merits of Jesus Christ, who died for that sinner. So that's why we've got to fight the devil if we have the misfortune to fall into sin, the devil of discouragement who likes to sit right there, and once he's got someone down in sin, what does the devil like to do? He likes to start kicking him. No, we've got to fight that devil of discouragement, and to fight back by prayer, because the devil hates prayer, because he knows that by prayer God will hear us, and, not for our sake, but for his own sake, will grant us the grace that we ask. Let's go on to consider, finally, the conditions of prayer. There are 3. Prayer must be humble, it must be confident, and it must be persevering. It must be humble, because remember what St. Peter tells us in his epistle: God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. We can't simply go up to God and say, hey God, you've got to listen to me. Look at what I've done for you. You owe me something, God. Ew. That kind of pride is disgusting. No, we can't do that. We've got to admit, go up to God and say, you owe me something. No, but to realize I'm still, by my nature, I'm a sinner. And as a result, I put my hands out, hoping in God to give me what I need. Prayer also must be confident. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas tells us that the efficacy of prayer does not depend on our merits, on our worthiness, but on God's mercy. Remember that God doesn't give us things because we're so good, but rather because he is good. Oftentimes as traditionalist Catholics, we tend to get that stuck-up traditionalist nose, tending to think, I'm so special. Look, God's called me to this traditional Catholic community. He must know how wonderful I am. Oh, he knew that I'd be such a good traditionalist Catholic. Ew. No, that arrogance is so disgusting to God. No, the reason why we're traditional Catholics anyway, you and me, it's not because God thought, oh wow, that person, oh wow, he's going to make such a good priest. Oh wow, that's going to be such the perfect traditionalist Catholic. It's not because of that. It's God looking down and saying, hey, there's a miserable sinner who needs my help. If I don't make that person a traditional Catholic, they're never going to save their soul. That's why God gives us the grace to be a traditional Catholic. It's not because we're good, but because he is good. We must therefore be confident in our prayers because they depend on God's mercy. Everyone who asks receives, Jesus tells us in the gospel, whether a saint or a sinner. Prayer must also be persevering. Now, we've noticed before that while God hears our prayers immediately, he doesn't always answer our prayers immediately. And why is that? It's because oftentimes God wants to find out how much do we really want something. So suppose that we just said, okay, God, I'd like the grace of salvation. And then the next day, oh, so you haven't given it to me? I'm not going to pray anymore. Huh? It doesn't make sense. God is saying, it's like God saying, okay, how much do you really want it? Are you going to keep on asking me for it each day of your life? If you really want charity for your neighbor, if you really want peace in your homes, if you really want to learn forgiveness of others, how much do you really want it? Are you willing to keep on fighting for it, to keep on praying for it, keep on asking me for it, or are you going to give up? So God does demand perseverance in prayer, and that's why he doesn't answer our prayers immediately. It's like with a little child. Suppose that you gave your child absolutely everything the child ever asked for. What a brat it would grow up to be, right? It would be constantly demanding everything. I want this. Why didn't you get me the bigger size one? Well, that's how we'd be also if God just gave us absolutely everything we wanted at the very moment that we asked for it. So God, like a good father, teaches us perseverance. And Jesus reminds us in the gospel, we ought always to pray and not to faint. In other words, don't give up praying just because it seems that God isn't answering your prayer. He's just finding out how much you really want it. We've seen the necessity of prayer, its efficacy, and its conditions. We can ask then, when ought we to pray? Well, firstly, we need to say our morning and evening prayers, even if they're short, even if it's the 3 Hail Marys, and I'll come back to that. Even if it's just 2 minutes each morning and evening, at least we need to thank God for giving us another day and thanking Him at the end of the day for having got us through the day. Because if we don't thank God, how can we ever expect Him to give anything to us? We need to pray before and after meals. It's easy, I know, to forget our Thanksgiving prayer after meals, but we should make the effort at remembering, because we always appreciate it among ourselves when someone tells us thank you for something that we've done. Well, same thing with God. He appreciates it when we tell Him thank you. And this goes especially, of course, for men at work. I know that it's easy to fall into human respect, and because there's probably a lot of non-Catholics around there, and so it's easy to make a little Santa Claus like this, or perhaps even forego it entirely. Well, that's just wimping out. Now, we don't have to go to the opposite extreme and sort of make this huge sign of the cross. That's the opposite extreme. Just do it normally, and that way people will ask questions, actually. They might ask if you're a Buddhist or something, and then you can actually tell them something. That's God sending that soul to you, to be able to say, as Catholics, we make what's called the sign of the cross before and after our prayers as a sign of our faith in the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and in our belief that Jesus Christ, who is our Savior, has died for love of us so that we can get to heaven. And by just a little catechetical thing like that, you're actually planting a seed in that soul. So that's why it's good not to wimp out when saying our prayers at work. We ought to pray also, especially in times of temptation. Oftentimes, prayer is the first thing that goes out of our mind at such times, when that should be the first thing that stays there. St. Alphonsus, in his wonderful book, The Glories of Mary, gives some wonderful words there which can apply to any kind of temptation, but he applies them specifically to the impure temptation. And he says, if during times of temptation you immediately call on the holy name of the Blessed Virgin Mary, you can be sure that you will not have fallen into mortal sin. Because Mary, being your good spiritual mother, will make sure that you do not lose the grace and friendship of her divine Son. Wonderful words to encourage us to keep that name of Mary, as St. Bernard says, ever on our lips and in our hearts. A very powerful weapon, then, against all the attacks of the devil. I would like to speak specifically about the devotion of the 3 Hail Marys. You will see on the table next to the door going out of the church where the brown scapulars are, there are small pamphlets printed up with the picture of the crucifixion on one side, and inside you will read there about this devotion of the 3 Hail Marys. This devotion goes back to the very early ages of the church. In fact, this is where the practice of the Angelus developed from. It was later taken up by a Franciscan monk, St. Leonard of Port Morris, back in around the 1600s, and later on also taken up by St. Alphonsus de Liguori, founder of the Redemptorists. And the devotion is that when you get up in the morning and before you go to bed at night, either to prostrate yourself on the floor, if you're physically able to, or if not, simply to kneel down, and to pray 3 Hail Marys in honor of the Immaculate Conception of Our Lady and of her virginal purity. There are 3 graces attached to this persevering practice. Firstly, the grace of chastity. No small grace, that. Secondly, that if by misfortune one should happen to lose the grace of God through sin, that you will be able to receive the grace to get back to confession as soon as possible. Thirdly, the third grace attached to this is the grace of final perseverance, which we also know as the grace of salvation. So certainly for such a small price, as it were, we can get so much from God, who is always so generous with us. Prayer is easy. It's not something difficult. Even mental prayer, which is something that, for instance, after you hear one of these sermons, you go back home in the evening and then you mull over a little bit about what you've heard, that already is a form of mental prayer. We use mental prayer all the time. That's what the rosary is. It's not something difficult. Oftentimes we think of it as being something difficult. Oftentimes we think of mental prayer as being something more than vocal prayer, when it's not actually. St. Alphonsus, in his Moral Theology, explains that for any prayer to be good, it must be mental, so that instead of having vocal prayer here and mental prayer up here, it's actually mental prayer, which is the foundation of any prayer, and vocal prayer, in other words, the words spoken with the lips, are added on top of the mental prayer. I remember as a child, we went through our catechism. It was a Baltimore catechism, of course, with all the nice little drawings in it, cartoons. And I remember I was maybe about 8 years old at the time, and we were studying the chapter on prayer. And you had the two little pictures there. One was a picture of, it said, vocal prayer under it. And it's a nice little picture of a family kneeling down, praying the rosary in front of a statue of Our Lady. And of course, at age 8, I thought, oh, that's nice and easy. I know I can do that. And then on the other side, you had this other picture, and underneath it said, mental prayer. And you have this picture of a priest or seminarian kneeling at a prie-dieu with his head in his hands, and he looks like he's really in pain. And I thought, ew, who'd want to ever to do mental prayer? So it's not that hard. And it's important to realize that mental prayer isn't hard. Mental prayer, as St. Alphonsus says, is necessary for adult Catholics to reach salvation. We've got to be able to think about the truths of our religion. We've got to be able to think about the lives of Jesus and Mary as we do in our rosary, and therefore draw fruit for our own lives from their lives. Now you might ask, what about the case of distractions? Well, let's distinguish. There are deliberate distractions and indeliberate distractions. Let's take the case of deliberate distractions. You go through maybe 8 Hail Marys of your rosary when suddenly you realize, oh my gosh, I've been thinking about palm trees all this time. And then you realize, yeah, and I prefer thinking about palm trees. That's a deliberate distraction, and that's going to be venially sinful, because if we're talking to someone, in this case God, we should be paying attention to the one we're talking to. Now, however, then there's the other case of indeliberate distractions. Let's take a case of you get through 8 Hail Marys of your rosary and you think, oh my gosh, I've been thinking about palm trees all this time. Let me turn my mind back to the thought of Jesus and Mary. No sin whatsoever. Nor has your prayer been useless. Quite the contrary, is that your heart was still being given to God, even though your imagination was wandering elsewhere. And it's what your heart is doing that's important. And little by little, your heart will be able to draw back the imagination and the other faculties of the soul back to focus on God. So certainly, whenever you have distractions, just very quietly set them aside every time they come, no matter how frequently they come. And your prayer will still be absolutely good and useful in God's sight. I would now like to go on to the subject of devotion to Mary, just briefly, because St. Alphonsus says that for missions, there are 2 things which must never be omitted from any mission. One is a sermon on prayer, and the other is a sermon on devotion to Mary. He says anything else could, if necessary, be omitted, even death, hell, and all those other things. But these 2 means of perseverance must never be lacking. And it only makes sense. Prayer is the life of our soul. It's the breath of our interior life. And Mary has given us life itself, Jesus Christ. She is our mother because she is the mother of Jesus. And don't we like to think about our mother? Especially if she is such a wonderful mother as our spiritual mother in heaven is. Behold thy mother is what Jesus said to St. John while he was there on the cross. And he says it to each one of you also. Because you belong to Jesus, he has given Mary to each one of you. And she therefore has a great care over you. She is indeed a most powerful mother in your regard. And she is also a most merciful mother for you. Let's take a look at these two notions with regards to Our Lady, and this should give us great confidence in Mary's protection and also a great desire to love her more. Firstly, Our Lady is a most powerful mother towards you. Well, we can see this even in the Old Testament, that there were certain people that God chose in order to intercede for others. Because as we all know, the Protestants have the notion that we can only go to Jesus Christ and we can't possibly go to any other saint. It would be an insult to God. Bosh. Let's take a look at that even in the Old Testament. Even in the Old Testament, Abraham was there interceding with God on behalf of the city of Sodom even. Likewise also, Moses, time and time again, went up to God and said, Lord, hold your anger against your chosen people. Let your wrath fall on me instead. Once again, we see this notion of intercession. Also with King David, God himself says in the Old Testament that for the sake of David, my servant, I will spare the city of Jerusalem. So it's true that even in the Old Testament, we see this notion of saints interceding with God on behalf of the people. So the Protestant notion is totally unscriptural entirely. And now, if God accepted the intercession of these saints even in the Old Testament, how much more does he accept the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary? We know that Jesus is our sole mediator with God the Father, but that does not prevent us from having other mediaries with Jesus Christ. That's what Mary is. She brings us to her Son. That's what the other saints and angels do also. They bring us to Jesus Christ, who brings us to the Father. Our Lady then is a most powerful mother for you, precisely because she is the mother of Jesus. And Jesus, therefore, just as he obeyed her while he was alive on this earth, he still obeys her, as the saints say, now that he's in heaven. They say that has not changed at all. Jesus is still obedient to his mother. If Mary asks for someone's salvation, Jesus will grant it. Therefore, the importance of asking Our Lady every day for this grace of the salvation of our immortal souls. We can recall also the power that Our Lady has exerted over the entire world, over this history of all these centuries of Christianity. Look at all the churches dedicated to her. Look at even the cities named after her. Think of all the monuments built in her honor. She is this pure vase, as it were, that allows the light of God to come straight through it and pass again out without keeping anything for herself. Everything in her is from God, and everything in her goes back to God. That's why God loves this immaculate Virgin so much. All generations shall call me blessed, Mary says. And we see this in the many statues that we have, the different images of Our Lady. They all remind us of this wonderful mother that we have in heaven, who is not, as Father DeLallo said the other night, is not like God is somewhere halfway between Jupiter and Saturn. Rather, he's so close to us, and Our Lady, by her power, is so close to us also. She sees us from her heavenly place, and she helps us in every moment of our life. Every grace that comes to us from God comes to us through her hands. She is indeed a most powerful mother.